Hello, everyone. My name is Sharnice Peters. I'm a program analyst for the Division of Energy Assistance within the Office of Community Services. On behalf of OCS, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar providing a 60-minute review of FY 2022 Carryover and Reallotment Report. Today's webinar will be presented by John Thompson of OCS and Dan Bouch from Reprise. Next slide, please. Today's webinar has 5 main purposes or goals. First, John Thompson from OCS will provide important reminders about fiscal requirements and reporting. Second, this webinar will explain the purpose of the Carryover and Reallotment Report and how it is used by OCS and by grant recipients. Third, this webinar will highlight the minor report changes from last year. Then this webinar will go over key concepts in each reporting line. Lastly, this webinar will provide resources to help LIHEAP and fiscal staff find information to understand and complete the report. The audience for today's webinar includes LIHEAP program staff and fiscal staff who assist with the report. We are happy to have state, territory, and tribal grant recipients here with us today as well. We greatly appreciate your time joining us today, and we hope that this is helpful as you complete your Carryover and Reallotment Report for fiscal year 2022. Dan, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sharnice. My name's Dan Bouch. I am with Reprise, and Reprise is a technical assistance contractor for OCS that assists with LIHEAP and works on this report. So that's why I'm here to present today. I also wanted to note that Melissa Torgerson is also here. She's not a presenter for certain slides, but she's here to help if I miss anything or to help answer questions. And she works for Verve Associates and also helps provide technical assistance to grant recipients. So for today's webinar, it is a 60-minute webinar. So we'll be going for about an hour. We do have the slides available for download now. So if you want to grab them to hang on to them and look at them in more detail later, or if you want to share them with other people that work on the report or work in LIHEAP, they're in the GoToWebinar bar you should see on the side of your screen under handouts, and there's a little PDF symbol. And this webinar is being recorded so that it can be published later on ACF's YouTube channel. So all the webinars about how to complete the reports are recorded and posted there. So that should be available later this month for you to access or share. So we do encourage you to think about questions and to ask questions during the webinar. So you can do that at any time during the webinar in the GoToWebinar question box. There's a picture here of what it looks like. You can type it in and we're compiling them all. And at the end of the webinar, we'll have time for Q&A and we'll work to answer them. So we really encourage you to think of questions that would be helpful for you, also helpful for the whole group. If it's a very specific question about your procedures or a question related to your policies, we might not be able to answer it here, but we encourage you to participate and ask questions. Okay, here's the outline for the presentation. We're going to start off with some general fiscal reminders, then we'll move into the FY22 Carryover and Reallotment Report, why the report exists, what the report's asking for, and we'll look at each line of the report together. We'll also talk about how to submit the report in the OLDC system. And this outline's really here to just be helpful if you save the slides so you can quickly find what you're looking for in the future. All right, so we want to start with a poll question to help us get a better sense of the audience and what level of detail to go on different aspects of the report. So Nicholas is going to open this poll. If you could share, how much experience do you have with the LIHEAP Carryover and Reallotment Report? These are just anonymous polls to help us get a sense of the audience. So do you have less than 2 years of experience with the report, 2 to 4 years, 5 to 10 years, or more than 10 years? And we'll leave it open for a little while people respond. I also wanted to note while you're responding, if you or your colleagues ever have trouble getting into the webinar or issues registering, you can reach out to us to let us know so we can help work through those technical issues. Or if you have questions that pop in your head after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. All right, maybe we'll give it 10 more seconds, Nicholas.
Yep. Looks like 80% have voted, so I can close it now.
Okay. Okay, so about 60% have less than 2 years experience. So we're hoping that this webinar will be really valuable for you if you're working on the report. And then we have 10 to 20% with more experience across each of the categories. So that's good to know, and we will make sure to go into a lot of detail for everyone who's newer to the report. Okay, we're going to move on now to LIHEAP fiscal reminders and reports, and I'm going to turn it to John Thompson from OCS to provide you with these reminders.
Thanks so much, Dan. It is a pleasure to participate in this webinar in collaboration with Dan and Melissa. And welcome to everyone who's listening today. I hope that we can provide some really important or helpful tips that will assist you in your administration of LIHEAP. So I just want to first start off that, as you see in the first bullet there, that everyone, grant recipients, you have requirements and rules and practices for administering LIHEAP. And so, you know, to further elaborate on that, the next bullet, that's all provided in the statute and regulations, which I hope by now everyone is familiar with, section 2605, or the federal regulations that we normally, or that we'll speak about in other webinars and site visits. If you're so lucky to have a site visit and receive a report from us, you know the uniform guidance, we use those federal regulations, or 45 CFR. CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations. There's common regulations that we quote from in conjunction with others. And more importantly, because LIHEAP is a block grant, you will use your own state, territorial, tribal regulations, definitions to form, you know, how you're going to govern LIHEAP or administer it. And that is extremely important, as long as that your definitions are not erroneous in comparison with our federal regulations. LIHEAP, since it is a block grant, gives you that flexibility to adopt your own rules. And we encourage all of our grant recipients to check, you know, internally. This last bullet is more for program staff, you know, to work with your own fiscal staff and understanding a lot of the requirements that are put in place, because a lot of times, you know, program and fiscal will operate separately. So it's just good sometimes to have a meeting of the minds, whether you know, weekly or monthly or semi-annually, to talk about you know, what is in place for LIHEAP, how to administer that in the best way. Next slide. And so here we're going to just talk a little bit about reporting. So as many of you all know on this call, that you are required to submit fiscal information to our office in the form of reporting. We're going to talk about that. I want to talk about that a little bit later, about the specific kind of reports. But in that, the reporting of fiscal information, it does a lot of things for our office. One is it helps us to monitor how your LIHEAP funds are being obligated and used by all of our grant recipients. And it also, for reporting purposes, it helps us to document information to Congress, our administration, and to the public as well, administer this information back to the public, and helping for everyone to understand how the funds are being used and their impacts. And lastly, it helps for analysis purposes and provides this information. It allows you to compare this information with your uses in comparison with how other grant recipients use their LIHEAP funds. So we're not just asking for reporting to make your lives miserable, but this reporting does serve a specific purpose, and those are a few of them. Next slide. And so, as I alluded to, we do have certain reports that we require for reporting purposes. And as you can see in this little matrix here, the quarterly report, we ask of you to submit, and you see a little brief description of what we use it for, the amount of funds are obligated through each quarter. The grant survey, which is only required by states to submit, and it helps us to see how much funds you have available to obligate, as well as the funds that you did obligate pertaining to each type of assistance that was administered. The other two reports, we're going to talk a lot about the Carryover Reallotment Report today. That helps us see projected unobligated balances for each funding type. And as that report has grown over the last 2 years because of the supplemental reporting, supplemental funds that have been issued out by LIHEAP, in CARES, ARP, the IIJA funds. So it's even more important that we have webinars like this. I think we lost the slide where we're at. Oops, we went backwards. There we go. All right, thank you. And then for also the Federal Financial Report, also known as the SF-425, which allows us to see data on expenditures and unobligated funds that are being reported. And so we just want to mention, at the SF-425 that when for each funding stream that you receive, for example, when I mentioned all the supplemental funds that we received for like CARES and ARP, IIJA, you have to submit a SF-425 report for each funding stream that you receive. And depending on the period of the grant, so for instance, your regular LIHEAP allocation, for instance, there's a 2-year grant period on that. So you would submit a SF-425 for the first year of your regular LIHEAP funding, and then for the second year of your regular LIHEAP funding. And for any subsequent funding that you receive, it's the same process for reporting the SF-425. And here, I just want to talk about some reminders about fiscal reporting. And these are some ways to avoid some issues or with your reporting. I alluded to earlier about program and fiscal staff. That's an ongoing partnership. That's something that we are here at LIHEAP that we've stressed a lot in the last few years. And the reason why is because we've noticed more and more how certain reports are done by program staff and certain reports are done by fiscal staff. And we've seen that there's been financial discrepancies in the reporting. And a lot of that could be avoided if program and fiscal staff, depending on what reports that you are submitting, would just come together and see what kind of numbers you have, where you getting your information from, and make sure that that information is in sync with one another, which avoids those discrepancies and less questions from our office. Another way to avoid some issues is just document your procedures. and hope that's self-explanatory why, but it ensures, consistency in the way the grant is administered, and also it just helps when there's staff turnover. And another thing, if you do have procedures, to make sure that they're being followed. Sometimes we can get into a monotonous routine, but just making sure that whatever's written down, they're accurate, up to date, which will ensure accurate reporting and consistency across reports. In the last slide, it was, that matrix, it showed the SF425 and the Carryover Reallotment Report side by side with one another. And if you noticed in some of the narrative that was there, it talked about, or it just mentioned that those reports both report on unobligated balances. And so it's like a full circle here, in the sense that if you have staff that are preparing those reports, make sure that their data is consistent and that the unobligated balances that are being reported sync with one another. And this is important because when a lot of times in our assessments or our monitoring reviews, our site visits, we've noticed that that's the most common discrepancy amongst those two reports, is what's being reported for unobligated balances. And lastly, just revise reports if needed. And for what I'm referring to in these two reports, the Carryover Reallotment Report and SF425, you could, the SF425 is normally submitted towards the end of the year, and the Carryover Reallotment Report is submitted way before that, in August. And so there's time from the time that the carryover report is submitted to the end of the year, there could be changes that have taken place as far as reporting. And we have encouraged more so during the years that if you have seen changes fiscally, that you can go back and revise your carryover reallotment report to be more accurate with the reporting that has taken place since this first submission. And so right now I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for those reminders. So we heard a good overview of the different reports that involve financial reporting, and now we're going to dive in and look in more detail at the Carryover and Reallotment Report for federal fiscal year 2022. First, talking about why that report exists, what the goals are for the report, and then I'll talk about the changes to the report since last year. Okay, so as John mentioned, there are a number of reports where you provide different kinds of financial information. The Carryover and Reallotment Report is one where you're asked to just report a few numbers in this report, but it's very important for HHS, and it's very important for you because it helps to identify of the funds you've been awarded in a year, what portion of those funds and what dollar amount have been obligated, what portion are being carried over for obligation in the next year, and what portion, if any, cannot be carried over and need to be returned to HHS. So when we're thinking about this report, it's important to remember that grant recipients have to obligate a certain portion of their funds each fiscal year. For regular funds, block grant award funds, it's no less than 90% have to be awarded in the fiscal year that you receive them. The carryover report is asking you to report on the amount that were not obligated during that same fiscal year that you received the funds, and were either carried over to the next year or are being returned to the federal government. The report, as John mentioned, is typically due in August, which is before the end of the federal fiscal year, and that helps you and helps OCS to identify if there might be a challenge in being able to obligate the funds you receive. And then the final report is generally due in December to show the final amount that you have carried over or returned. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for the report that the report that is due this fall, the 2022 Carryover and Reallotment Report, the good news is that there have only been minor changes to the report, 2 minor changes that that I want to highlight for you. So the first is that, as John mentioned, the report has had to expand in recent years because of new funding, LIHEAP funding streams or funding sources. So you've had the issuance of the infrastructure funds, for example. Last year in the report, you were asked to report information bundled together for your regular block grant funds, along with the reallotment funds and the Infrastructure Act funds, including the amount that was unobligated. This year, you're still provided with the total amount you received in regular block grants, reallotment funds, and infrastructure funds. But the report's going to ask you for the unobligated balance you have to break it out by regular grant funds from the block grant or the reallotment funds you received versus the unobligated balance from the infrastructure funds. So it's going to ask you for 2 fields instead of 1 in this part of the report, and we'll show you that a little later in the webinar. Second change is that a section of the report that was there last year is not there this year, and that was the special section for reporting on the Supplemental CARES Act funds. The reason that section was removed is because the CARES funds were obligated, were awarded to you in federal fiscal year 2020, and they needed to be fully obligated by the end of 2021. And so since those funds needed to be obligated and can no longer be obligated or carried over, that section of the report has been removed. In terms of how you complete the report, as in the past, is to be completed in the OLDC system through Grant Solutions, and it is now available for you to access it in OLDC. Okay, I'm going to go over some of the key concepts that need to be talked about with the Carryover and Reallotment Report. All right, first important concept is to remember that LIHEAP consists of more than one funding type. And at this time, you may have several funding types that you're utilizing in one way or another for your program. So there's 5 that I've listed here. Those block grant funds that are awarded annually by HHS. There's a smaller amount of what's called reallotment funds that typically comes around the end of a federal fiscal year. Those are funds that are awarded based on returned funds the prior year. There's the Infrastructure Act LIHEAP funds that were awarded in FFY 2022 and 2023. Then there were the supplemental funds through the CARES Act and through the ARPA, the ARPA Act, which were awarded in 2021. So you have these multiple different funding streams that you may be utilizing and that need to be tracked and reported on. All right, so when we think about the Carryover and Reallotment Report for 2022, good news is you don't need to report on all of those. You need to report on these 4 listed here. So you need to look at your block grant funds that were awarded in 2022, your reallotment funds that you received also for 2022, Infrastructure Act LIHEAP funds you received in that year, and any supplemental ARPA funds that need to be returned. You don't need to report data for CARES, as I mentioned earlier. So there should be no dollar amounts you report that include any CARES dollars. And if you're a grantee, a grant recipient that utilizes other funds to help support your program, like local funds or state funds, those are also not included. This report's just looking at the federal funds you receive from HHS for LIHEAP. So that's LIHEAP funding types. So we'll go to the second key concept for reporting, and that's obligations. So this is a very important one for the report. As I mentioned earlier, you're required to obligate funds in ways that are consistent with the LIHEAP statute and regulations. The LIHEAP statute provides flexibility in exactly how grant recipients can define what constitutes an obligation of funds. So there are varying definitions across grant recipients. Obligations are not always the same as expenditures. They can be similar depending on how a state might define what an obligation is, but they can also be separate and distinct. So when we're looking at it, I'm going to go over some examples of each kind that different grant recipients use, but expenditures generally include the issuance of a benefit. And in some cases, such as recently with the supplemental funds, you may have obligated funds, but not actually expended those or paid those out until the end of a fiscal year. Such as you might obligate funds for heating assistance, but a portion of those funds might not be expended until later. We're going to look at some examples on the next two slides, so let's jump ahead to those. Okay, so when we're looking at obligations and expenditures, we thought it'd be helpful to just give a few examples. So obligations tend to involve a commitment or agreement. There's usually a legal component, and it's important, as John mentioned, for you to check your state, territory, or tribal rules, and to see how obligation is defined, and to make sure the information is laid out in writing for you and for the future. Expenditures usually are focused on payments and should also be laid out in writing. So some examples of obligation as defined by some grant recipients are when funds are issued and there's an award letter, when there's credit lines established with vendors, when there's a purchase order, or a contract to perform certain services. When we look at expenditures on the next slide, some common examples of how grant recipients define expenditures are when a payment is made to a vendor on behalf of a client, when there's purchases for supplies or payments for salaries, or payments for local agency operations and salaries. So again, the important thing to remember here is that with obligations and expenditures, because there's flexibility, that it's really important to understand your own rules for your state or territory or tribe, and to consult with OCS if you have questions or if something might need clarification. So bringing this back to the Carryover and Reallotment Report, that report again is focused on the obligation of funds that were awarded. So that's how those funds were designated, how they were laid out in an agreement, et cetera, during the specific fiscal year. Let's say you obligated funds in one year, but you didn't actually issue benefits to households until later, a later year. If those funds were obligated, then they count as being obligated for this report, and they don't get counted in the lines that refer to unobligated balance. Here's an example on the bottom of this slide. Let's say you received $1 million in regular funds for 2022. If your jurisdiction obligated all $1 million during 2022, based on your definition of obligation, but you have some amount of those funds that hasn't yet been issued as benefits to households. So let's say you obligated it for cooling assistance, but there's still a portion of households that are going to get their benefit later in 2023. You would report all $1 million as being obligated. So in your carryover and reallotment report, on the line for unobligated regular funds, you would report $0, because again, obligations and expenditures in this case, they haven't expended all the funds, but based on their definition of obligation, you would report it as obligated. Melissa, is there anything you want to say there that I missed?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. All right, carryover funds. This is another important concept for the report. So any funds that were not obligated that you are electing to carry over or save for the subsequent year to hold available for obligation in that next year, those are called carryover funds. Your regular block grant funds and the Infrastructure Act funds that you received in 2022 can be carried over into 2023 according to the allowable limits. You're allowed to carry over up to 10% of you were allowed to carry up to 10% of your regular LIHEAP funds or infrastructure funds. So that means you needed to have obligated 90% during 2022. For ARPA, you cannot carry over funds into 2023 for your ARPA funds. Any remaining unobligated funds from the American Rescue Plan Act LIHEAP funds that you received at the end of 2022, which was September 30th, must be returned to OCS. Again, this is obligation. This doesn't mean a benefit paid necessarily. And if you have a question or you have a concern here, we encourage you to contact your program specialist. Okay, so returned funds, which I just referenced, those are any funds that exceed the carryover limit for a particular source, or funds that were not able to be obligated during the allowable obligation period. This can be for a number of different reasons, but one of the purposes of the carryover report is to help be able to identify if grantees might need some assistance in obligating funds or working through challenges there. So if funds need to be returned to HHS, you should contact your liaison to discuss the situation, and returned funds get reallocated and distributed to grant recipients in the next year. So we really encourage you, if you're thinking you might have to return some funds even unrelated to this report for this coming year, or you realized that there were funds that were not obligated as you do this report, we encourage you to reach out to your liaisons to see. Sometimes there's a clear answer or something that can help you work through that process. Okay, now we're going to go into the actual report and look at it. And we're going to focus first on section 1. We'll show you what each part looks like. Okay, so Section 1 of the carryover report is focused on your what's called your regular LIHEAP funds. Regular LIHEAP funds, for the purpose of the report, do include the additional Infrastructure Act funds, which those funds have the same carryover rules as your block grant funds. So for fiscal year 2022, regular block grant funds, regular LIHEAP funds includes your block grant funds you received at the beginning of 2022. It includes reallotment funds you may have been awarded. And I want to clarify that not every grant recipient gets reallotment funds, because it depends on the amount and how the LIHEAP funds are awarded through the formula procedure. And then lastly are the Infrastructure Act funds that were awarded in 2022. There are no other funding. Congress did not appropriate any other additional funds for 2022. Again, regular funds does not include the ARPA funds. Those are in a separate section that we'll go over. Doesn't include any funds you received that are non-federal, that are local or state. And if you had funds that you received in 2021 and you carried over to 2022, you've already reported on those funds being carried over in last year's report, so you don't include those funds here. Okay, so pictures can be helpful. This is the picture right from OLDC. We're going to go line by line. Starting with line 1 is current year amount payable. This is going to be pre-populated for you by OCS and locked from editing. This gets pre-populated based on the award amount. So when you look at this in OLDC, you should check to see if it matches what you expect based on your award amounts, or if you're seeing something that might be challenging. So this will be pre-populated. Next slide. The form will automatically calculate for you what the carryover limit is on line 1.2 as 10% for regular funds. So the only two lines you need to fill in for section 1 are lines with numbers, are lines 1.3 and 1.4. Line 1.3 is where you'll put the unobligated balance of your regular block grant funds, reallotment funds. So that could be an amount you're carrying over or carrying over or returning. Line 1.4, you'll report the same thing for your Infrastructure Act funds. So you need to be able to know for each of those two pots what portion of the funds were obligated versus not obligated. At the bottom here, if the amount you report is within the 10% limit, it'll populate for you and show a 0. If you have an amount here that's over the allowable limit, it will populate these lines for you. It'll populate the bottom line for you, showing the amount that needs to be returned for reallotment. So again, you report on two lines here, 1.3, 1.4. The other lines self-populate for you. One thing that's really important with this report to help OCS is that if you have funds that you're carrying over that were not obligated, that you help explain what your purpose of carrying over the funds is, or why those funds will not be obligated in the fiscal year, and how you're intending to use any funds you carry over in the next year. So there's two parts of the report where you're asked to provide a written description to answer these questions, 1.4a and 1.4b. So we really encourage you to just take the time to answer those to help give OCS good information about why those funds are carried over. Okay, section 2 of the report is focused on the funds you received from the American Rescue Plan Act, LIHEAP funds. So we're going to look at that next. So remember, the ARPA funds are distinct from the regular LIHEAP funds. You had to obligate all of the ARPA funds, either during federal fiscal year 2021 or 2022. No portion of them can be carried over for obligation past 2022. You need to make sure you have the procedures in place with these and all other funds to track and report in this way. And now we'll look at what the screen looks like for this section in OLDC. So here's what section 2 looks like. This first line again is going to be pre-populated for you with the amount of ARPA funds you received from HHS in 2021. So that'll be that amount payable. If you should check it against your records. If you see an issue, reach out to us or to your program specialist so we can correct it. Next slide. The only line you have to fill out here is line 2.2, which is the projected unobligated balance for ARPA. So this is a line where you want to check with your fiscal staff or check your records and make sure that that if you're aware that some ARPA funds were not able to be obligated during FY21 and 22, that you report that that remainder here. If you know you obligated all your ARPA funds by the end of FY 2022, this should remain 0. Line 2.3 here is going to pre-populate for you. It's going to do the math from line 2.1 to 2.2 so that you won't have to do that, but it will show you the projected amount that needs to be returned, which will match line 2.2. Can you actually go back one, Nicholas? Also, you'll see on the bottom here, there's a notes field for you to also provide information if some funds were not obligated, to explain why in this notes section, 2.3b. Okay. All right, now we're going to talk about report versions and submitting the report. So the Carryover Reallotment Report is now available in OLDC. There were some delays while the OLDC system was updated, but that is available now. You're encouraged to submit your preliminary report if you have not in OLDC. That was due November 1st, so if you haven't done it, if you're able to go in and submit that information in OLDC. The final report will be due December 30th. And so you're encouraged on December 30th to make sure that you have the correct information, and as John mentioned, that you're consistent with your SF425 form. One thing that's important to know is the unobligated balance can change because of returns, refunds from vendors, updated information. You're not expected to update this on an ongoing, continual, forever basis, but you are expected to make sure it's consistent across the reports. So we encourage you to make sure that when you submit on December 30th, it's consistent across those 2 reports. Next. There's those 3 other reports John mentioned that also have fiscal information. So you want to make sure if you're trying to check if your carryover report is correct, it may be useful to look against these other reports. And when you do your grantee survey later, early next year, if you have an update, you can also submit a revision to the carryover report to make sure that report's consistent with the grantee survey. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the submission process in OLDC. If you're not familiar with OLDC, we have some slides at the end of the webinar to help you get familiarized with it, and we have contact information for how to contact Grant Solutions, which runs OLDC and helps with accessing it. There's 4 steps in working on a report. After you initiate it or open the report, if you enter any information, you need to save it. When you're ready to check the report, you need to, there's a validate step. Once you validate it, it helps do those math calculations on those lines I mentioned. And it'll alert you if there's any issues. Then you certify the report with the appropriate person in your program that has the authority to do that. And then you officially change the report to being submitted. Again, there's some slides at the end to help walk through this process. So for some final reminders on the carryover report, there's two sections, one for reporting on your regular LIHEAP funds with the Infrastructure Act funds, a separate section for ARPA funds. There's only $3 amounts you need to enter in the report. One is the unobligated amount of regular block grant funds and reallotment funds. Second is any unobligated balance from your 2022 infrastructure funds. Third is any remaining unobligated ARPA funds that were not able to be obligated during the allowable period. There are also notes fields where you're asked to provide information, as I mentioned. Preliminary report is due, and the final report will be due at the end of December. I wanted to turn it back for a minute to John to talk about the federal financial report SF425, since that is also due soon. I'll turn it back to you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And so as Dan alluded to, just speak briefly on the SF425. And I did make a few references to this earlier. So everyone, all grant recipients must submit an SF425. If you should all know this by now if you've been submitting your SF425, but they are now being submitted through PSC. And we have a link there for you to get more information about that. If you have not set up your account in SF and PSC yet, well, PSC is the actual overseer, but you actually submitted them through the PMS system, which is a payment management system. And so very important that if you have not submitted your SF425s, as of this change went into effect at the end of 2021. So if you've not submitted your SF425s by then, hopefully the Office of Grant Management would have reached out to you by now to alert you of that. And so information being reported on there is the amount of the funds that were obligated and expended during that particular federal fiscal year. So your regular LIHEAP grant allocation, let's use that as an example, has 2 years, as I said before. So you would report on your first year, which would be your initial submission, and then the second year of the grant, you would submit your final SF425, which shows your information for your last obligations and expenditures in that second year. Spoke about submission through PMS. And lastly, the SF425 is due at the end of December. So make sure that that report is submitted. Your estimated version, it's good to have that prepped and ready for submission, but we're really looking at your final submission as well. That's the one that will be reviewed over for any errors or things of that nature. And back to you, Dan. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you, John. So this slide is really helpful, especially if you're fiscal staff or if you're newer to the report or the program. These are different resources. You can click on them in the slides that are in the handouts. that are really helpful for understanding different requirements or giving you tools to help. So I want to highlight the third bullet down is the information memorandum that OCS issued related to LIHEAP expenditures. That has some really helpful guidance to help with some of what we talked about here with understanding expenditures and obligations. We have 2 resources that are available on the LIHEAP clearinghouse. One is a fiscal management overview. The other is a tool to help states with estimating carryover and doing different projections. So that's the second bullet. And then there's 2 webinars at the bottom. If you missed our LIHEAP 101 webinar on the basics of operating a LIHEAP program, that's available to watch. And there's also a subgrantee fiscal monitoring webinar from 2021. So the action transmittal and instructions for the carryover report are available. They were used to help create this training webinar. You can find those on the action transmittal page of the LIHEAP website and linked here. There you can also find your OCS program specialists or liaison. OCS recently hired new liaison staff, so you may have a new program specialist. So we encourage you to look there if you're not sure who to contact. You can always contact us as well at our team if you're facing challenges. And I want to stress too that even though we went into detail on the report and talked about all the nuances, that if you're newer, this report has existed for a long time, and grant recipients have submitted it each year. So it's likely that that someone in your department or someone who works on the program has some familiarity with where to get the fiscal information or who to contact, and there's not anything major that is different from in the past. It's the same reporting on obligations of funding sources. Okay, we're going to take questions now. While we go through the questions here, I'm going to ask Nicholas if he can open up the poll. We have a poll question we want to ask because we want to understand how helpful or not helpful this webinar was in understanding what is needed to complete the 2022 Carryover and Reallotment Report. So if Nicholas can open it, and if you can take some time, we use that to try to plan for future webinars and make them better. And then we can look at some questions. So we'll give it a few more seconds if you can go ahead and answer. Melissa, is there anything else you wanna mention before we take questions?
The only thing, or one of the things I was thinking of, is that some grant recipients do not base their program on the fiscal year. They use a calendar year or some other variation, you know, June to June or January to December. But this report is really focused on the fiscal year, regardless of when your program year is. So I think that's an important distinction.
Right. All right, Nicholas, why don't we close the poll? Okay, it looks like most people thought it was helpful. That's good. Let's see if we have any questions so we can answer some questions with our last 5 minutes. So Nicholas, do we have anything that's come in?
Yes. So one question was, the SF425 for ARPA shows it going through 2023. Is that correct?
John, are you able to speak to that?
Yes, I can speak to that. Well, the ARPA had 2 years of reporting, and that was last year. And you were allowed to carry over, if you didn't obligate any funds from ARPA in FY21, then you were allowed to carry it over into FY22, which was the second year of that supplemental grant. And then at the end of FY22, you were required to obligate all of those funds. So as far as reporting on ARP funds in the FY23, there should be no reporting as far as obligations. All that has taken place already. We do understand that if you obligated your funds at the end of FY22, that there is an expenditure or liquidation period that is occurring right now. And so we've been in communication with a lot of grant recipients about that. But as far as for reporting purposes, there are no more obligations being done on ARP funding. We should see no more of that. And your expenditures will be occurring via PMS. Your drawdowns to cover any for your obligations that were incurred. You'll be I'm sorry, for the obligations that were made. Now you'll be drawing down from PMS for any expenditures that are incurred.
Thank
So
you,
I
John.
hope that answered the question.
Okay, Nicholas, do we have any others that have come in?
Yes, so one other question. I enter reports in both OLDC and PMS. Just wondering if the reports will all be in one system in the near future.
I think the answer to that is probably no. I think PMS is used for specific, John may know, but for specific financial reports across the government. And OLDC is more for specialized LIHEAP, used for specialized LIHEAP reports. Is that your understanding, Melissa or John?
PMS is specifically a payment management system, and I think that's even what it stands for. I mean, it's specifically for drawdowns, expenditures,
Right.
Versus OLDC, which is used in other programs besides LIHEAP, but it's really more of a program reporting piece. So,
Yeah.
Another question. We submitted only the ARPA SF425 through PMS, not the Black grant. Will all LIHEAP funding streams require the SF425 to be submitted through PMS?
Yes, the answer to that question is yes. Going as of December 31st, 2021, all SF425s are to be submitted via PMS.
Another question. I was wondering why there is language on the report this year regarding using ARPA funds held for FY23 if none can be carried over. It specifies unobligated funds, so I was a little confused.
Yeah. Yes, I understand what you mean by that. I think for the report, it will show you that this amount is unobligated and has to be returned, but some of the language is similar to what was there last year or to other funding sources. So yeah, it's important to remember those funds can't be carried over, so any unobligated balance has to be returned. Well, I think we're hitting the hour mark now. Want to remind you that this is recorded, that the slides are here if you need them. If you had a question and it wasn't answered, we'll work to try to follow up with you individually. Again, you can always email us. We greatly appreciate your time today and want to thank Sharnice and John and Nicholas for running the slides. And thank you for your attendance today. We hope you have a good rest of your day.